Journalists and the profession as a whole has come under fire in recent weeks. This week, former Bosasa COO Angelo Agrizzi told the Zondo Commission that some journalists were on the controversial company's payroll. Journalists also got a tongue lashing from the Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo over the publishing of testimonies that had not been presented before the inquiry. Now, another criticism was from Daily Maverick's Farrell Hafaji, saying many journalists attending the EFF's news conference this week were engaged in a sloppy love fest, some to say, as well as giggling and having a rhetoric. So what is the state of journalism in the country? Are we losing the real reputation of journalism as a profession? To discuss this matter further, we're joined in studio by Anton Harbour from Wits University, as well as Chamano Makadi, a broadcast lecturer from Tshwane University of Technology. Gentlemen, thanks a lot for joining us this evening. Perhaps we should start off with you, Anton. I mean, obviously you've been following some of the stories. You followed the Zondo Commission's hearing, the criticism coming up from the Deputy Chief Justice. Obviously this was about leaking certain statements from the witness ahead of the Commission actually even deliberating on the matter in itself. So it appears as though the profession of journalism has come under fire in this country, but it's not the first time, would you not say? So what do you have to say to that?
Look, one must be careful about generalizing about the state of our journalism across the country, because one has to start by saying that there are some real pockets of excellence. You know, investigative journalists have done remarkable work. Some have done remarkable work in helping tackle corruption, uncover state corruption, played a key role in stopping it happen. And so one must be careful of generalizing across all journalists.
Yeah.
But yes, we're in a profession that's under enormous financial and political pressure, and the combination of the political attempts to undermine our independent media and the financial pressures because of the changes in the world of media, the rise of social media in particular, mean that we really need to think about how we support and ensure not just the survival, but create a situation in which we can have more of the good journalism and less of the bad journalism.
So then when we're looking at it, Chamana, from the perspective of how do we sort of foster or enhance an environment for good journalism, but I also don't want us to protect those who are managing to get their fingers dirty and putting their fingers in the pie, because you cannot be prosecutor and judge at the same time and expect to win. So what do we do about this bad apples that seem to really making the rest of the profession seem absolutely unworthy and uncredible?
I think it's important to start by acknowledging the fact that we have people that are doing really fantastic work. Yes, let us also admit the fact that you have people that have not been doing well. I mean, what do we do? And that's the question you are asking. I think we've got to be talking to some of these people directly, if it means talking to editors.
I was hoping that you guys would say something like, we got to be firing them, not talking to them. So I'm just using the Zondo Commission and some of the statements that came out of the Zondo Commission, for example, saying that, you know, journalists were bribed to actually give favorable reports regarding the organization, and also some were bribed to make the state capture allegations go away. Those are people that will bring the complete profession into disrepute. I don't even think those people deserve to be called journalists at that stage. It's just, it's theft, really, or just it's criminal activity that, whether or not you're there standing as a journalist, should not be tolerated.
There's absolutely no excuse for some of the things that we have seen. I mean, you're citing an example of what we have seen, particularly with the story that has emerged from the Zondo Commission. I mean, I was just talking to Prof shortly before we came on air here, and some of the things that I feel very strongly about is that we still have to do verification of, facts. We have to verify those facts. If somebody just print an email and they believe that it's coming from so and so, this X amount of money was paid to this particular organization, I mean, the person who is alleged to have written the email, number one, you could have easily just telephoned that person or go and talk to them directly. In this case, was that done? And the answer is no. And that for me, it's pure recklessness. And that's why I'm saying there's absolutely no excuse for that. But yes, we have to engage with some of these people. We have to talk to them, because it's not just about an individual journalist, is not just about this particular media house, it's about the profession itself.
Yeah. Well, the profession, it appears as though, Prof, it's getting a little bit too familiar. One, Fairil Haffajee actually came into criticism, under fire for actually criticizing some of those journalists that were getting too familiar with the commander-in-chiefs during the EFF's conference in itself. So then how do you tell the story and hold someone to account, the very same person you're seen to be fraternizing with, so to say?
Let me just, before I get to that, just say on the question of the allegations that journalists have been bribed by Bosasa and perhaps others. As journalists, we have to make sure that those people are exposed and that they're prosecuted. And as journalists, we will help that prosecution because it taints us all.
Yeah.
And there's a real danger of that kind of fraud in journalism. They're not journalists. We've got to drive them out the profession and hopefully get them jailed. Let's be unequivocal about that. But yes, I think Fairil Haffajee pointed out a real problem that people go along to press conferences and they pally and they're over-friendly with the politicians who are speaking. And it sometimes crosses a line. And I think we've seen that, and we've seen politicians use and abuse that.
Politicians use and abuse that, or journalists use and abuse their profession? In other words, and this is going to bring me to my next point about the new rise of journalism in this country. And we're going to talk a little bit about social media and the influence it's had. But it appears as though we've got more individuals wanting to be celebrities than them reporting the story. In other words, more people wanting to be part of the story than them actually reporting on the story, which then goes into the lines being blurred and the over-familiarity with, you know, the subject that you're supposed to be reporting on.
So I think I define the problem as a problem of factional journalism. Journalists who see themselves as not just part of a political cause or a political party, but often of a faction within a political party. And we've seen a number of our best-known political writers who
Like who?
I don't think this is the place to name names. I think we
But you've
we
just
know
said,
the
Prof, that
culprits.
we need to actually expose these individuals. If we're to expose them and if we're going to get rid of such journalism, should we not be the ones that are spearheading that initiative and
Sorry,
saying
I said we
and
must
exposing
expose those who take bribes.
So not
I think we
those
must
who are-
criticize those
who are
who are
over-familiar.
factional, who are over-familiar with politicians, who use their journalists to back one faction or another, particularly within the ruling party, but in other parties as well, because it doesn't produce good journalism. That's the bottom line, is that it produces bad journalism, and we need to stop that.
Journalists are not politicians, and journalists are not supposed to be too friendly with politicians. The other thing that we also have to note is that, yes, the work they do requires them to have relationships with politicians as sources, right? But there has to be limit. There has to be limit. You can't be friends to a point where stories get to be compromised. I mean, especially now when we're going towards elections.
Number of journalists who are compromised in this instance, right? There are few journalists that are compromised in this instance. My question then it would be, do people, when they're taking up this job, when you're sitting down in HR and they're actually asking you about your credentials and your capabilities to be a journalist and you're answering yes, 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 do you actually know what the job entails? Do we have journalists in this country that know what the job entails and understand the ethics code behind journalism, and are they keeping to that ethics code? Or is it that the lines are so blurred that it's all about becoming popular and getting social media following and being relevant, right, and cool to the market, that you've completely negated your job in the first place?
Journalism is not a profession for celebrities. Anyone who wants to be a celebrity, let them go and do other things, and not in journalism. We don't do journalism because we want to be popular. This is a profession that requires you to understand that you are servicing people. And it's also not about a friendship. But I mean, maybe let me just come back to this point. I think where training starts, and I guess that's where it matters the most, and by the time you hire somebody to work in your newsroom, you must have gone through certain things and find out who this person is.
Yeah.
And that's very important. It's not just a matter of looking at their CV, because a CV can also lie.
Prof, you've worked in newsrooms, extensive newsrooms. Would you say that the newsroom is indicative of individuals that completely understand their job description, or are these newsrooms becoming more and more blurred as more politicians are coming out and more of them want to become relevant as opposed to be able to tell the story?
I think it varies enormously. There are some newsrooms that are wholly captured by one political party, and there are others that are more independent, where there's a debate and a contestation within those newsrooms.
Then how do we start exposing newsrooms? You cannot, I don't believe that we can have a newsroom that is a captured newsroom is a newsroom that fails to tell objective stories, a newsroom that fails to get to the bottom of the truth, a newsroom that fails to service the people, as you're saying. So you cannot possibly have newsrooms that are captured, and we're still referring to them as newsrooms. Who are these newsrooms that are captured so people can know that they're captured?
We all knew ANN7 and the New Age ran captured newsrooms. We're seeing it in independent newspapers now at the moment.
Okay.
And I think it's a major problem. And I think
so you would say that independent newspapers currently are more aligning and more siding or leaning towards being captured as opposed to being completely independent.
I don't think there's any question that under Iqbal's survey, independent newspapers have become part of factional politics. And that the standard of independent journalism there has deteriorated sadly and tragically for an important newspaper group. We saw it at the SABC. There was a great deterioration in their journalism because they became factional. There's an attempt now to re-establish their independence and regenerate the newsroom, and that's an excellent and wonderful and very positive thing. So there are a number of positive things happening. I am concerned that there are newsrooms which continue to employ people who've shown a dubious ethical practice, who've been factional journalists, and who've shifted with the tides as the ruling party factions shift. I am bewildered that some of our major outlets continue to employ and re-employ such.
Before I close, do you think that the South African National Editors Forum protects these kinds of journalists? And because, I mean, they've come out in defense of certain journalists, saying that, you know what, we need to get to the bottom of this. They've criticized some of it, saying that journalists who are bribed should obviously be confronted and they should actually be put to jail. But then do you think that there is a line of protection coming in from SANEF in defense, as opposed to saying, guys, get your stuff together or else ship out?
I don't think SANEF protects anyone, except to say they stand for, freedom of expression, media freedom, and those are the things that they have been championing
Prof, do you agree with them?
over the years. And of course, those that have not been doing things right, they have been saying throughout the week, let those who are in the wrong, let them be exposed.
Do you agree?
I don't think they've protected journalists, for example, who've taken bribes, and I think we've seen in the last week them taking an active role to try and take it on and have it exposed. They do protect the profession, but you must realize we also, there's been a systematic attempt politically to undermine the independence of much of our journalism. And we need to fight that, and we need to expose that, and we need to get South Africans to understand the value, the importance of independent journalism, and to build that up, because it has been under quite systematic attack for some years.
Well, it's definitely a conversation that is going to continue. And you rightly mentioned the fact that it is election season, which means that people are going to see more and more stories come out. And hopefully the integrity of our journalism is actually protected in this country. Thank you so much to the both of you for joining us this evening and shedding some light in terms of just some of those stories. And looking at how the journalism profession appears to be under criticism and scrutiny, and how do we move forward telling those objective stories and actually servicing South Africa.